Those grotesque scenes have been played out over the last 2 weeks in the Gaza Strip. It's Hamas theater, the final humiliation and show of power and force before releasing Israeli and Thai hostages who they've held in the harshest conditions for the last 16 months, many of them spending their whole time in captivity in the dark, damp, stinking tunnels, starved and more. Joining us today to talk about the release and the drama behind it, FDD Senior Fellow, former IDF spokesperson, and the man who is everywhere, a very good friend of the State of Tel Aviv podcast as well, Jonathan Conricus. Wonderful to have him. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and now doing everything possible, along with so many others, to help bring them all home, every last hostage, alive and dead, now. Thanks for being here. Saturday, February 1st. Lovely to see you, Jonathan Conricus, on this very emotional day in what has been an extraordinarily intense time in Israel.
Yes, Vivian, thank you. It's great to be with you again. It's another bittersweet day, an emotional roller coaster again, another installment of this grotesque reality show that we're in, where we get to see these Islamist thugs parade around Israeli civilians, manhandle them around, and use them as props for their vile propaganda. To tell you the fact, the different emotions that I feel bubbling up, of course, tremendously happy for the families. I share their joy when I see them embrace, see them come back to their families, especially those who have live ones. It fills the heart, and it makes, it puts everything into context, and it tells you again, this is what we are, this is what's worth fighting for, and that's beautiful. But then I'm also angry. I am angry that I see these terrorists still running Gaza, and I see them managing this propaganda against Israel, and I see them prancing around as if they won. This isn't where I wanted to be 15 months after, almost 16 months after Hamas's attack on Israel. I don't think it's where we should be. And I am concerned that we still have a long, long way to go. Many more Israeli hostages still in Hamas captivity. So there's worry and fear for the future as well. But, looking at today, yes, joy, anger, frustration. But I feel similar sense of what I felt on October 7 as well, when it comes to the urge to get back to fighting and finish Hamas off. They obviously were not finished off, and we obviously still need to get the job done for our sake and for the sake of our children. Also for Gaza and regional stability and all that jazz that people speak about, but really for our sake, we need to get it done. And we haven't, and that's on us to do.
You were saying earlier when we were chatting, we were discussing really the grotesqueness of these theater shows that Hamas is staging. Of course, with the production assistance and equipment of Al Jazeera, which
Yep.
has exclusive on filming. I happen to be of the view that every country in the world should pull Al Jazeera's broadcasting license because it is a terrorist network. It is not a legitimate broadcasting network.
It
But
is.
absolutely.
I mean,
But
they shouldn't have satellite leases. They shouldn't have IP addresses. They shouldn't have any services that allows them to spew their hatred. They promote terror. They spew violence and hatred. They are in bed with Sunni terrorist organizations, and they're really a mouthpiece for violence, hatred, and almost all of the bad causes in the world. You'll find them promoted by Al Jazeera. So why that is being allowed by the US, by Europe, by other allegedly freedom-loving democratic countries is beyond me.
And let's not neglect to mention that Al Jazeera, of course, is a Qatari state-funded so-called broadcasting and print outlet. And I refer to them as the arm of the Qatari Ministry of Propaganda. I don't think that that officially exists, but it might as well. But they did have, of course, an exclusive on all of the filming and broadcasting from these grotesque theater shows being put on over the last 2 weeks in Gaza. And among other things, in addition to these thugs, these masked thugs, you know, trying their hardest to demean these hostages, having them sign certificates of release, giving them souvenir bags to commemorate their time spent in captivity in Gaza, forcing them to stand there and wave and smile for the cameras as if they're just so heartbroken. And, it's very difficult to tear themselves away. That must be effective messaging for someone, but also behind them are banners and signs with all manner of slogans and maps that very clearly project and state the real aims and goals of Hamas. Talk about
Totally.
a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, symbolism here is very, very important. And I mean, I've been looking at forcing myself to analyze these orchestrated shows. And you can see that Hamas has put a lot of effort and attention into detail. From the small things, they're displaying weapons that they took from dead Israeli soldiers, whether it's soldiers that they killed on October the 7th or special forces that launched a raid inside Khan Yunis in November 18 and unfortunately left behind weapons. They're displaying them as well. They were parading around in an Israeli stolen Ram pickup truck that they stole on October 7. And there's a lot of symbolism everywhere. The location that they chose in Jabalia, where they released Agam Berger, they specifically wrote in Hebrew that this is where allegedly, they broke the Givati Brigade, infantry brigade of the IDF that fought bravely there, killed lots of terrorists, but unfortunately had a lot of casualties as well. And what I think was very telling and interesting was what I saw today in Khan Yunis, where the backdrop, both in Khan Yunis and in the Gaza port, where the backdrop posters that they had printed out had slogans in Hebrew that said, "Zionism will not win." In Hebrew, for the first time, I think also without spelling mistakes or having letters backwards and other stuff that they usually do, but they had it in proper Hebrew, and the message is loud and clear. This isn't about Gaza. This isn't only about Gaza or getting humanitarian aid to Palestinians or freeing Palestinian prisoners, terrorists from Israeli prisons. And it's not about the situation in Gaza. It's not about the so-called siege of Gaza. This is about all of Israel. When they say Zionism will not win, what they're also saying is we will win. And what's we? We is jihadi Islam taking over Palestine, what we call Israel, and eradicating Israel. And I actually thank Hamas for putting that out in clear, bold letters for people around the world and in Israel to see what this really is about. It isn't about a ceasefire in Gaza. This is about, and if you listen to what Hamas are saying, this is a fight about the land of Israel, and what we're seeing is just a milestone. And they will continue to do this as long as they can until they reach their ultimate goal of destruction of Israel. And they're saying it loud and clear. We should be listening. People around the world should be taking notice of it. But, not surprised even for a millisecond that this wasn't even picked up upon when, as far as what I've seen on international media and what I've seen British American media covering it, A lot of other details are mentioned, a lot of other details about Palestinians and whatnot, but that specific centerpiece of Hamas messaging, not really reported on, because it doesn't, it doesn't jive well with the general message here. And of course, anybody who is historically married to the two-state solution, that's a problem. Because if what the Palestinians are aspiring is to defeat Zionism, then where does that put a two-state solution? So there's a lot to unfold. And, as I spoke about emotions in the first part of the podcast here, but when you analyze things a little bit and when you look at what the enemy is saying, a very telling day.
Very telling indeed, very telling, 2 weeks in fact. And the slogans that you refer to that are plastered all over the backdrop and also the skirt kind of below the stage and around the stage, in every case, the messages, the slogans are written in Arabic, in English, and in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And, there's also pointedly a map that shows all of Israel as Palestine. I mean, there's no nuance or ambiguity in the message. Hamas is committed to destroying Israel. They have never wavered from that message. It's enshrined in their political charter. So, it's really quite incredible that they can put out these very violent messages about annihilating Israel. And that to hear, I mean, you monitor the international media more carefully than I do, and to hear that that's being ignored is, again, not surprising, but um, kind of surreal, I have to
Yeah,
say. I
it
want to
is.
point out one other thing about the monopoly of Al Jazeera and how they abuse it, because I think it's significant. There was this disaster on Thursday. We saw Agam Berger, the last of the 5 young female soldiers who had been held since October 7th, and she was held back alone. It was just sheer cruelty. She was released in the ruins of a home where Yahya Sinwar was assassinated, where he met his end. But the main event on Thursday was in Khan Yunis, and it involved the release of 80-year-old Gadi Moses on his own 2 feet. Just unbelievable. 29-year-old Arbel Yehud, a tiny little woman. They apparently, we've now learned, were held in total isolation throughout their time in captivity. And there were also 5 Thai workers who had been agricultural workers at Nir Oz, at the kibbutz where Gadi and Arbel lived. And what's interesting is that Al Jazeera did not broadcast the release of the 5 Thai workers. Why? I'm going to offer a thesis
Yeah.
because it doesn't fit their narrative. This is a war against Jews. So why were they holding these Thai workers? And there are more Thai workers as well. I mean, we know that primarily because they used them as cleaners and cooks, so it was kind of handy for them, I think. But Al Jazeera kind of left that part out because that would get a little messy to explain. The other thing they left out was 80-year-old Gadi Moses, who clearly wanted to maintain his dignity and walk from the Hamas vehicle to the Red Cross vehicle. It turned out to be a surge, a crushing surge of quite frenzied, quote, civilians in Gaza. There was a real concern that Gadi and Arbel were going to be lynched. It
Yeah.
was not controlled. And what Al Jazeera did not show is that during that walk, as Gadi Moses is being held up by 2 thugs on either side, he apparently fainted. They cut that part out.
Yeah.
And this is nothing compared to the cruelty that we know has been happening to these poor people for almost 16 months. Let's talk a bit about the show of force by Hamas. They're driving around in late model, brand new Toyota trucks. We know they love Toyota. Toyota should really do something about that. We were told that all of their smuggling routes from the Sinai Desert into the Gaza Strip in those huge tunnels. We have been told for months now that they have been destroyed. We see these pickup trucks just full of, 15, 20, maybe more well-uniformed, well-armed, well-fed terrorists. It's a very theatrical show of force. Is it real?
Well, it's real in the sense of Hamas still existing, Hamas obviously having the organizational and logistic capacity to bring about these choreographed shows week after week, and frankly, doing them slightly better every time, I would say. The Islamic Jihad, their organization was abysmal and total chaos, as you explained. Terribly disturbing scenes to see. I remember watching the hand of Abeli Hood. Her finger, her knuckles were white. She was clutching the hand of one of the Hamas and Islamic Jihad thugs that were leading her out. Amongst that crowd, you could see how terrified she was, and I mean, the level of cruelty. I mean, she endured almost 16 months of isolation in captivity. She's brought out into daylight for the first time, and she sees a sea of Palestinian men and boys. I didn't see a single woman in frame, but a sea of Palestinian men and boys with weapons, cheering, shoving, and pushing. Really disgusting scenes. But when you look at Hamas, what this means is that they are around. They have money, they have food, they have the logistic capacity to wash and iron uniforms and to issue weapons. And their fighters look like they've been taken care of, and they don't look malnourished. And this is disturbing because you understand that we still, as I said in the beginning, we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to Hamas. They're, of course, putting on a show, and they're, of course, displaying the best and the strongest that they have in these shows of force, which maybe for Arab and Gazan eyes are persuasive. Maybe they're bringing that message home of victory, steadfastness. It's important concept in Palestinian ethos is steadfastness, or sumud, their ability to stand strong and oppose adverse conditions, specifically fighting against Israel. And that's an important point of it. And I suppose that if you're fooled by these theatrics, then you would believe that they indeed are standing strong. And there are many disturbing things. They're printing these giant posters. Where is that done? Why is there a functioning printing outlet in Gaza? And why is Hamas able to do so? Where do the vehicles come from? If they're importing vehicles, are they coming through the so-called humanitarian aid above ground, or are they smuggled underground? If they are smuggled underground, what else is being smuggled? Because we can rest assured that if Hamas is smuggling goods into Gaza, they're not focusing on fine arts or fancy food. They're focusing on things that kill, weapons, or support systems for weapons. So many questions to be asked about this ceremony. But anything that your enemy shows and gives away can and will also be used against that enemy when the time comes to go back to fighting. And I say when, it's not if. We will go back to fighting Hamas, and hopefully next time we'll get the job done. They're displaying a lot: locations, vehicles, units, personnel, some faces we've seen, types of weapon, and a few other things that I won't point out here that will come in useful and will be used. And I think that they are already being processed into the targeting bank of the IDF, and they're part of that machinery now. So it's not all in vain, and I'm sure that Hamas is aware of this, but something tells me that they just can't help it. It's prime time, it's live coverage, global. They just can't help but to put on a show, maybe too much of a show for what's good for them, but time will tell.
You put it perfectly when we were speaking earlier today when you said this is kind of like, an ongoing Super Bowl for them.
Yeah, this is prime time. I mean, I don't think that they will ever get a better opportunity to showcase their propaganda. It's broadcasted live. Agencies are on the ground. Reuters has been broadcasting from there, of course, live and almost non-stop at the Al Jazeera, and carried around the world as well. This is prime time, and and they clearly understand it. They clearly understand it, and they want to harness and leverage it.
I want to close out with something that I think is we've just learned very recently in the last few days, and it's really significant. You mentioned earlier, after doing a number of media interviews today, you stopped off at Hostage Square, as we call it,
Yeah,
in Tel Aviv, which in normal times functions as a cultural square. There's a theater, there's a beautiful art gallery, there's a library. It's also become, ground zero for the support movement for the families and the hostages, large gatherings, support rallies, I like to call them, every Saturday night, sometimes more frequently, all kinds of artistic displays, a tunnel, a kind of replica of a tunnel that's been set up there. There's kind of hostage family farm offices nearby. There are accommodations for the families where they can just kind of be sequestered and relaxed and away from the public glare. It's extraordinary what's gone on there. And you
yeah,
popped by today. Um, one of the things we know is for months, and I plead guilty to going to support rallies at least every Saturday night throughout the country and to doing much more in between.
yeah,
But there was a period of time where the government of Israel was rebuking those of us who did so and participated in those rallies. And they were saying, you must stop because you are playing into Hamas's hands. I'm not quite sure how. And you're strengthening their propaganda, their kind of muscle in that regard. Stop doing this. You're projecting weakness. We can't have that. It didn't really impact the momentum of the protests, rallies. And what we've learned in the last 2 weeks, bit by bit, is that many of the hostages had ongoing access to radio and television. The 5 female soldiers came back functionally fluent in Arabic, and they say it's because they were watching Al Jazeera all day long, and they were hearing radio. Same with the 3 women who were released on the first day, 2 weeks ago from today. They came back functionally fluent in Arabic, and in fact, their families commented that it was kind of funny because they would sit around and be speaking Arabic sometimes and not even realize what they were doing. And we know from them directly how this gave them succor, sustenance, really uplifted their morale. They knew we were fighting for them. They knew they weren't forgotten. They even knew when President Trump was elected, and that lifted their spirits. And they were thinking, there's going to be some kind of, consequence from all of this. And today and on the other days, but today in particular, there were 1 or 2 hostages who apparently remarked to their families they couldn't believe how quickly it happened. Talk about a bit about this kind of mixed messaging and why or how you understand the government of Israel telling us to stop. Don't go out on Saturday nights. And now we learn how important it was.
so this is really a, a complex issue, but there's also clarity in the complexity. The clarity of it is when you feel that something is right, I think you go according to what your gut tells you. And if your people are held hostage by a terrorist organization, then, well, you think of what are the tools that I have in order to effect change and in order to free them. If you have a paramilitary organization and you're a billionaire and you can launch a private assault and get people out, then maybe you do that. If you're an ordinary citizen in a democratic country that has the ability to voice his and her opinion, then what you probably do is to voice that opinion and say, I demand, my moral compass says, I want our people back, and I want my government and I want governments around the world to apply pressure on these low lives to get our people home, to free our people. And I think, that's the moral, that's the clarity of it. Now, it does become complicated because, of course, Hamas was, of course, monitoring that, and they were really playing and using the pressure and the protests in Israel in order to apply pressure on Israel. And we saw that in negotiations. We saw that they would release proof of life videos, these propaganda videos of psychological warfare where they recorded hostages and forced them to say these speeches in front of camera. Hamas would do that when they saw that there was pressure in Israel and when they saw that there was something going on and there was traction with negotiations. And of course, Hamas wanted there to be demonstrations on the ground, but you know what? I think that's less important. And I think that at the end of the day, getting them home is really what matters. Now, I can only regret, the level of polarization that we see more and more in Israeli society, where this government has been very quick to brand people who um, don't support the government or are critical towards it or have strong demands for accountability and to bring the hostages back and to fix this situation and to win the war. We see that this government is very fast to label those people as traitors, supporters of the enemy, defeatists, and many other things, which I think is not a good thing to do, to say the least. But I would say this, to counter that, I would also express my sadness at what I think have been political opportunists that have tainted the movement to get the hostages home. And I think that they have done a disservice also to the hostages by mixing miscontent with the government and certain elected ministers and people that I think are unfit for office, but getting that mixed in the really basic, extremely pure desire and call for our hostages to be freed. And that's been thrown into the mix as well. And I think we would be remiss not to speak about that. But to summarize, I think that, the slogan should have been free the hostages, not bring them home. It should have been free them, free our people, free our women, free our men, free our babies, free the hostages from Hamas. And of course, we should voice our love and support and prayer and yearning for our brothers and sisters to come home. I mean, for me, it's a no-brainer. It goes without saying. And it's sad that we even have to discuss it. And, I remember a press conference that Prime Minister Netanyahu did, where he specifically showed an alleged document that apparently afterwards it was debunked, but apparently was written by Sinwar or for Sinwar, which specifically where Prime Minister Netanyahu highlighted the demonstrations in Israel, and he said that, well, Hamas is monitoring it, and Hamas is aiming for those protests to be bigger and bigger, and as you said, insinuating that don't protest because Hamas likes it. That's also, by the way, the center of this whole episode that we have with the unauthorized release of classified information from the IDF to a German newspaper, which is also related to one of the PR workers or one of the spokespeople at the office of the Prime Minister. And one of the topics that those documents included was also the protests. So it all connects. But if we take spin aside and nonsense aside, then I think anybody who has taken part from a pure human, emotional point of view in showing solidarity, in strengthening the families, in providing comfort and support, speaking about it, wearing the ribbon, protesting around the world, wearing the shirt, doing and donating money, all of these things for the families of the hostages and for the forum. I think eventually people will understand that this was the right thing to do. And I'm sure that, I've seen lots of hostages, what they've written, what they chose to write and say, and what the families have said in their press statements. By the way, important point here, all of them thank Am Israel in Israel and abroad. Thank you for your support, for your love. It meant the world for us. This is what the families say. And the families, they thank President Trump and Envoy Witkoff. They thank the IDF and the security forces. Some have thanked the government. I haven't heard anybody thank Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think this is interesting. I may be mistaken, but I've heard 3 press releases by families, by Keith Siegel's family today. The press release, the joint release of 3 families of soldiers, the female observers. They did a press briefing at the hospital. They did it in Hebrew and in English. And they went a lot out of their way to thank a lot of people, but not Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think that's interesting. I'm not entirely sure that there's no room for acknowledgement, but on the other hand, I can understand with the political environment and the media environment how this came into being, especially with reports about the fact that this deal apparently has been on the table since late May 24.
I've paid really careful attention to this particular thing. Merav Gonen, who is the mother of Romy Gonen, who was at the Nova Festival, and she was released 2 weeks ago. Merav Gonen did thank the Prime Minister and the government for making the decision to support this deal. But other than that, I'm quite certain that no other family, in speaking to the press, has acknowledged or recognized Prime Minister Netanyahu. As you say, they have gone out of their way to express their gratitude towards President Trump, towards Steve Witkoff, who has been extraordinary on the ground too, just kind of dropped in the other day in the separate room that families have to relax.
Yeah,
Unannounced, no
yeah.
no protocol, just showed up to say, hey. He met with the soldiers, the female soldiers who have been
Yep.
released. He's met with all the families, and
And he went to Gaza, the first American official
yeah,
visiting Gaza in, I think it's 15 years.
he's getting his hands dirty. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, um, famously has not met with many of the families or even had any contact. But
Or
I don't
found the time to go to Nir Oz and speak with the
or have
community.
absolutely, but he also has not been clearly invited to come and see any of the released hostages or their families, because you and I recall very clearly when there was that extraordinarily daring commando rescue of 4 hostages, pardon me, in June,
Yes.
in early June,
Yep.
when a extraordinary Yamam officer
Yes.
died.
Arnon. Yes,
Yeah,
Arnon.
it was Operation Arnon Zamora.
Yep.
And he left, sadly, 2 little boys and a wife. But 4 hostages were rescued in a daytime raid, and Prime Minister Netanyahu did jump and go straight to the hospital. I think it was Ichilov Hospital on that day. He was not received by all of them, but he was by most. And that was on a Saturday afternoon. And this time when they've been in for that much longer, and our soldiers, our female soldiers, are coming out. The fact that there has been no opportunity created for him to go, I think says a lot.
Yeah, speaks volumes. And this is a man who is acutely aware of the importance of mass media and
Yes,
appearances.
he is. Jonathan Conricus, thank you so much, as always, for your time, insights. It's always so enlightening to speak to you, truly.
Thank you. I can
and
say the same.
I'm really glad that you made the time to speak to State of Tel Aviv today.
Thank you, Vivian. For better news.
always, always penetrating and thoughtful speaking with Jonathan Conricus. Thanks for being with us. We'll be back really soon. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.